Hi there. The Battle of Agincourt was famously portrayed in Shakespeare's Henry V, and the book does make reference to it. And I have previously reviewed the 1942 movie starring Sir Laurence Olivier, which was made at the express request of Sir Winston Churchill as a morale boost. And it was a terrific performance of the play for the camera in full colour. Terrific. It's my favourite version. But it's a play. However, it is based on the reality of the Battle of Agincourt, which has tended to inspire us over the years. And the book, Agincourt, the Battle of the Scarred King by Michael Livingston, is a very, very detailed account of an Anglo-French campaign by an American historian with no bias towards either side. So it's quite refreshing to get this kind of history. It's by no means a revisionist history in the accepted term. It's a history. In other words, Mr. Livingston has taken all the available current and previous research, all the documents, the maps, the archives, etc., and tried to put it into the context of what really happened as opposed to what we might think happened back then in 1415. The book really starts with the Battle of Shrewsbury, where Prince Hal, who is the young Henry, was leading a force to go to fight the Welsh, and the battle occurred at Shrewsbury, and he had the visor of his helmet open and he was hit in the face by an arrow. Now it didn't take him out of the battle, he kept on fighting, but then he needed treatment. Now, it's quite a feat, really, when you consider he was only 16 at the time. So the leading surgeon at the time devised a treatment plan, and the first thing they had to do was reduce the swelling and inflammation, because the plan was to pull the arrowhead back out through the wound track rather than push it through, which was the accepted method, familiar to all of us who watched Western movies. It couldn't be done because the arrowhead was resting against the spine, and the surgeon very, very wisely didn't want to cause any further trouble. The shaft was no longer in the arrowhead. Prince Hal himself had most likely pulled it out. 30-inch shaft would have been in the way. So the surgeon used a treatment of linen strips soaked in honey to clean the wound and reduce the swelling. Once the swelling had gone down, he very, very cleverly devised a set of internal forceps which would go into the socket of the arrowhead, and then using a screw device could be opened to grip the socket and then exert enough force pulling it back through the wound track. Now this must have been excruciating. Fortunately, it was a bodkin arrow, which is a long needle type arrow, rather than a broadhead arrow, which would have caused even more destruction. But nevertheless, it must have been absolute agony. The wound was then treated firstly by cleaning it with wine, and then with a mixture of oatmeal which had been boiled and then dried, selective herbs and more honey. And miraculously he survived this. Now, a friend of mine was shot several times and rushed to hospital, and they actually stabilized him and saved his life. But 5 days later he died of infection, and this is in the most modern hospital in today. So how someone can survive that kind of wound with no knowledge whatsoever of antiseptic really, and of bacteria and so on, was rather miraculous. So I was really impressed by that part of the story. By the way, this led to Henry later stocking his army with a vast amount of honey for the treatment of wounds. The book then covers the political scene in France with the Mad King, assassinations and attempted assassinations, and all the machinations of royalty at the time. The princes of various regions and the dukes were all vying for power and influence, and it's rather fascinating. So Hal is now Henry V, and he decides that he wants to exert his claims in France, and he amasses an army and a fleet complete with the honey, and cross the channel and start a campaign. And it's well known that he took the town, the walled city or town of Harfleur, and had to leave some of the guys there to garrison it, and then was on his way to Calais. Now this part of the book is absolutely fascinating, and it really is an insight into what it was like to be in Henry's army at that time, because they were starving, there wasn't much food around, they were full of dysentery, which caused dehydration. This was October, and most of them were sleeping outside in the rain and in the very, very cold marshy ground, and it must have been thoroughly miserable. And all the time they knew the French were amassing for a tremendous fight, so they had that in the back of their minds. There is quite a section on the tactics used, how the archers were deployed in battle at that time, the equipment of the archers, and the way that they were used, and reference back to the Battle of Crécy. Then there's a big section on the terrain, and where the accepted view of where Agincourt took place is disputed by Mr. Livingston, and he says the ground dictates the fight, which is true, and the ground has changed because there were massive forests at the time, and where you fit the numbers of the army and how the flanks would have been secured, all that kind of thing, very, very detailed. Whether or not it's of interest to the average reader is something else. Then we come to the actual battle, Crispin's Day, 25th of October. I was delighted to find that it is actually more or less as accepted in the Shakespeare version and in modern our modern consciousness ever since, that really it was the English longbowmen who made the difference, who basically won the day under the tactical supervision of the king, who placed them appropriately. And the again, the description of what that was like is absolutely horrific. To be one of the French, either the mounted knights or the men-at-arms on foot, advancing into the arrow storm. The absolute showering of clouds of arrows coming at you. Now, there's been some modern studies, and I'll put a link to a video where you can see people who are testing arrows a lot from the longbows at the time, which went up to 180-pound pull weights, against the contemporary armour of that time, and it's really fascinating. And one of the points is that even if the arrow doesn't penetrate, say, the breastplate, it would shatter, and the splinters would go up and quite often penetrate small junctions in the armour, and impairing vision. And for this reason, the men-at-arms on foot would have to keep their heads down. They didn't want to be looking up and receiving the arrows in the face, so they'd be keeping their heads down, limited the vision, which is already limited by the armour. And they'd be stumbling, and there was thick mud. While the mounted knights, even if they were able to withstand the arrows, the horses couldn't. The horses would just react instinctively, and they weren't fully armoured, the horses of those times. So there were plenty of vulnerable places. And Michael Livingston estimates that each of the French in that initial advance would have received something in the region of 64 arrows each, and that was the key to victory, really. The aftermath of the battle was terrible. It was a slaughter. It goes into a lot of details on it. I mentioned in the review of the Henry V film that I attended a lecture in the United States at one of the training conferences on mindset, and the American instructor showed us the Crispin Day speech from Henry V, and he made some points about it. And one of the points is that, quoting from Shakespeare, "This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered." That's what Shakespeare said, and it's true. We still remember them. To this day, centuries later, the feats of those English longbowmen and their compatriots who were starving, shivering, dehydrated, bellies cramped, nevertheless fought against a fresh army with overwhelming numerical superiority and won a famous victory on the day. And the book really does justice to that, and I really commend it.